Hi, everyone. Welcome to our inaugural Critical Discourse and Design series, a digital forum to explore design and its social implications through the lens of people, pedagogy, and practice. My name is Christine Bown. I'm Vice President of Professional Development and Industry Engagement at Art Center College of Design. Today's panel explores design and technology for social equity and features a remarkable panel of creative leaders that you'll learn about in a moment. But before we get started, I'd like to thank Toyota Motor Corporation for their support in endowing this series. And I'd also like to thank our phenomenal programming committee, Maggie Hendry, who is Art Center's Chair of Graduate Media Design and Undergraduate Interaction Design, Robbie Knock, Director of Entrepreneurship and Professional Practice, JD Buckley, who is Art Center Interaction Design faculty, Everard Williams, who's an Art Center alum and Associate Chair of our Photography and Imaging Department, Kristen Stain, who's an Art Center alum, and she's the designer and illustrator of our Critical Discourse series, the beautiful invite that you've all received with those illustrations. Kevin Simmons, Art Center alum, and last but certainly not least, Azeez Ali-Balogun, Art Center alum and our moderator for today's talk. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And one last thing before we begin, I just want to share our format with you. So Azeez will be moderating the panel today, which should run about 1 hour, followed by a half hour for Q&A. You can submit questions to our speakers through the Zoom Q&A portion. We're also recording. Oh my God. Sorry. We're also recording today's talk, and you can find that link once it's up. I'm going to get off and introduce Azeez. Pardon my dog.
We like dogs. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Azeez Ali. I am a product designer that focuses a lot on AI and machine learning products. And so I'm definitely excited to moderate this. I'm excited for everyone to join this and hear this conversation with our guest. It's a bunch of amazing people that I really admire. Iddris Sandu, Aishatu Gwadabe, Ari Melenciano. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. And if you could just, say your name, where you're located, and just kind of briefly about like, what are some current things that you're working on? So I can start with Aishatu first and then go to Iddris and then Ari.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm calling from Benin, West Africa, and I'm a peace innovator working at the intersection of peace building, post-colonial thinking, emerging technology, and design thinking. So I'm currently part of a global AI leadership lab that co-creates solutions for sustainable development. As a peace advisor, I work for the German Civil Peace Service, where I'm implementing a project in the Regional West Africa program in Benin together with local civil society organizations. And the main objective is to build dialogue platforms and develop activities leading to cross-border conflict transformation and conflict prevention. So I'm very excited to be here and to talk about also a framework I've been developing in innovation and the design discipline. So thank you.
All right, Iddris.
Hey all, my name is Iddris Sandu. A lot of people call me Iddris, or you could call me I. I'm calling from LA, Los Angeles, California. I define myself as a architectural technologist or cultural architect. And I define that as a verb definition and not a noun definition, because the verb is an ongoing, continuous process. And basically my work is taking digital systems as well as physical systems and quantifying them from the perspective of hardware and software development. More specifically, I take high-end concepts or high-level concepts that are usually attributed for 5% of technological application, whether that's hardware or software, and bringing that to 95% of the masses, right? So one area that I have a lot of experience in and have been working on things in is in the hip hop space. So working with renowned high profile individuals to bridge the divide as well as the gap between technology and culture. And it's this way that I feel that we can bring the most level of awareness to not only the technologies that exist now, but the endless possibilities of what can be for the next generation of developers.
And Ari?
Hi, I'm Ari Melenciano, based in the East Coast of the US, and a lot of my work, or I generally identify foremost as an artist, and have found design and creative technology to be really great tools to expand that to the masses and find new ways for people to engage with, whatever is created, whatever space is created. I'm also an educator, so I teach courses, design and teach courses at NYU, some being, designing club culture and the revolution will be digitized. So, both positive and negative impacts of technology and the ways that culture is using, and also teach at the Pratt Institute's design school. And I'm also the founder of Afrotectopia. So it's a space that's exploring art, design, technology, Black culture, and activism together. And generally it's experienced through a festival, but more recently we've had an international cohort of Black innovators. So it's really about how can we create space for Black radical imagination.
Thank you for that. And so this conversation that we're about to embark on really tackles is looking at technology and design in terms of how it's been utilized today in order to develop the conditions that we are now. How has it been used for social domination? How has it been used for cultural domination or social liberation? And I want to start with you, Ari. You wrote an article titled Radical Technoculture for Social or Racial Equity. And if you can kind of give like some brief context, because in that article, you kind of spoke about technological determinism and how there was a choice to use technology in a certain way that kind of created a lot of the racial disparities and the inequity that we're existing today. And can you kind of touch a little bit more on really like what some of the key points you were talking about and wanted to get across in that article?
Yeah, I think the main point was that technology is simply reflective of the society in which it comes out of. So we often think that technology is kind of like a solution to the world's problems, and it's not. It's only going to be a mirror of that. And a lot of people have been using technology in a way where they're making things more convenient for a certain group of people, and they don't have people in the room or at the table that are thinking about all the systems that have been designed historically to make it convenient and efficient for only a certain group of people. So one example in that is something like with when Amazon first released their same day Amazon Prime, option, that was only serviced in a lot of the different cities that they serviced to. It was only serviced to the areas. It excluded the areas of predominantly Black people. And when, people asked Amazon, why did that happen? Like, understanding the intentions of it, Amazon brushed it off as if, it's because these spaces are harder to get to or this or that, and didn't acknowledge the racial inequity. And had someone like a sociologist or anthropologist had been in the room, they would have said, when we were designing and urban designing historically, Black people have been pushed to the literal margins of any area that they're in any urban area that they're in. And so they were only allowed to purchase homes near warehouses and commercial areas. So yes, the area is still more remote and harder to access, but it's not an excuse for such a wealthy company to not service that community. So it talks a lot about that. It also talks about the military origins of the internet and how it generally started off as a tool for surveillance when we were in the Vietnam War and in Southeast Asia. And it was just trying to understand how people operate, and the fact that, traditional warfare wasn't successful in that time of we can't go in and try and kill people with the guns and violence, but it's more, we need to understand how these people think so we can control them. So when you have a system that we're all using today with an origin like that, it's only going to continue to be the same thread in the internet that we work in today. So understanding that the internet is still a military surveillance tool. So it goes into, different societal impacts, but it generally means to expose people to the understanding that we can't be technologists and just focus on technology. We have to look at the whole world and look at history and how all of that affects technology.
Yeah, so that, I mean, that brings up some interesting points in terms of like, what is the purpose of technology? Does technology have a purpose, and who decides what that purpose is? And I mean, that's a question that I kind of want to pose to everyone on the panel. Like, so like Iddris, in the work that you're doing, I mean, you use technology for a wider range of things. You work for a very diverse set of people. So like in your perspective, I'll ask maybe three questions. Like, one, does technology have a purpose? Who gives it that purpose if it does? And then what is the purpose that's given to it?
Yeah, I think, Ari, you brought up some really, really great points. And I want to kind of weave some of the things that you were saying into the answer to this. I think technology has been given this face that it's multi-purpose, right? It can be used for a wide variety of things, but in reality, because of the inherent bias that exists for the creators that build it, we'll always never truly be able to create a one-size-fits-all, right? And the reason why that exists is because a lot of companies scale. They identify a problem, often target a specific group that they want to sell that product to or sell that service to, focus on that community. Eventually, the product gets bigger than what they thought it would be, and then later want to fix the diversity issues that are associated with that thing. And one thing that I've said several times is technology is simply a tool, right? A tool can be used for good and bad, right? Technology is neither good nor bad. It's in the hands of not only the creator that's creating it, but also who the creator is putting the hands of that technology, right? So it's like a double-edged type of thing. But I think what a lot of people fail to realize is that any technology that is developed with a non-diverse team from the ground up automatically renders it biased, period, right? And so it's important that now more than ever, in the ideation process, in the creation of these services, given the extensive repetitive behavior that we've seen with technology, new startups, new companies now need to start back at the drawing board and say, hey, before we even build this out, let's go, reach out to a diverse array of folk and get their opinions, as well as really go within community and see how they use technology differently. Because I will say too, depending on what community you come from, there's also not a one size fits all, not for the creation of it, but also the use cases of it, right? For example, the Black community uses Twitter is different than how another community would use it, right? So it's also very important for creators and creatives to think about how their ideas are not only going to be perceived, but more importantly, how people are going to use that. And from the fundamental beginning of these creations, we need to think about how they can be diverse from the ground up, right? Because we've seen so many occurrences of technologies like the initial cameras that had settings like white balance that were used for people of lighter complexion. And now how even as we're creating subsets of technologies, we're still seeing a lot of diction bias with these technologies as well, right? You have terminologies that are still used in programming to this day, like slave and master, right? When talking about referring to code. And although it's not relating to slavery, right? No one has really studied this from a true 360 standpoint as to, hey, we're living in 2020 now where majority of programmers don't just look a specific way. They also look this way and that way and this way and that way as well. And they're giving a unique lens and perspective to technology. So I think it's really important, right? For not only the lens of what is being created, but more importantly, the one who is creating what is to be created or consumed, to think about a 360 model versus a 180 or even a 90-degree model, and then say, hey, we'll fill out the rest of the, we'll fill everything out later.
Yeah, so I mean there's a lot of like really great points that I want to come back to in terms of like scale, in terms of technology being used to scale things, but also trying to build a diverse group of people to influence how it scales. But I shot to like some of the things that Iddris was talking about really like makes me think about the work that you're doing when we talk about like language and we talk about how the cultural context in which a technology exists in. In the work that you're doing in Benin, like how do you start to frame technology, especially in on the continent and in Africa? How do you start to frame technology in those cultural contexts, and what are your thought processes around that?
So maybe first of all, I will describe a little bit what technology means to me. So I agree with Iddris, technology is a tool that is used by humans, and technology is basically using knowledge, a knowledge system, to develop innovation. However, when you look at how technology is being framed right now, it's dominated by Western knowledge systems. And that is kind of a bit problematic because this kind of thinking excludes other ways of ontologies, epistemologies, ways of knowing, ways of being. And in order to um, describe the various stages of development of technology, you need to actually look at different, oops, my audio. So basically what I'm talking about is there's this critique that Western technology establishes itself as the universal by monopolizing credibility and marginalizing what is different. So I think also here we have to be a bit careful with this kind of critique because even the universal is just part of a particular. So we should, my approach, I look more at the world in terms of the pluriverse, which means we have many different ways of knowing that coexist, that all have value. And in my work as a peace advisor, I've been working specifically at fostering equitable societies, peaceful societies. And for that, you have to actually start with the premise of asking yourself, who are you as a designer? You know, for me, a designer is a facilitator, someone who's there to translate between the different actors rather than being the expert. And in my work, I believe that everyone is an expert based on their own lived experiences. So this is the premise that I work on, like, which is important to question yourself, to be aware of your own unconscious bias when you develop products, and to be aware that you as a designer have a very important role in ensuring that all kinds of stakeholders are being included. And when I talk about stakeholders, for me, it is important to actually have a paradigm shift towards more eco-centric ways of thinking, which means we shouldn't only center the human needs and experiences, but also non-humans, like animals or plants, land, water, materials, artifacts. And if you incorporate indigenous or non-Western thinking into the design process, you can actually have really interesting new ways of developing products. For instance, in Latin America, you have native tribes that believe that every decision they do, they have to incorporate someone from 7 generations in the future. So imagine if you have, if you incorporate this in the design process, and whenever you do design something, you think about the 7 generations in the future. So you develop more products that look into the needs of the environment, the needs of future generations, because they are also important stakeholders in whatever we do. So I think in order to use technology as a tool to create equitable societies that are peaceful and just and sustainable, you also have to make it in a way that it is community-led and controlled. So I'm not there. I'm there to facilitate. I don't own the process as a designer, but I'm there to facilitate, to create a space where all actors can, for themselves, identify the outcomes that they want. And I see my role as a designer as someone who does whatever I can to help them get there together, you know, not for them, but with them. Yeah, just a few thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot there, and I think some things that resonate with me is the word equity, and equity is being used quite a lot, especially like throughout this year. We've been switching from the terms of equality to equity. These are things that we've spoken about in many communities when we talk about diversity and inclusion. But I'm curious, and from all three of you, how technology can be used in order to create equity. Can it be used to create equity, and how does it actually create those conditions for equity? Iddris, you can.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's a very great question, because I think when I was a kid, I remember being a kid and watching Steve Jobs unveil the iPhone for the first time on stage, right? And I wasn't concerned with the product, even at a young age. It was an amazing, innovative product. They invented multi-touch that every other company would use after that. But I think the most important thing that he said in the whole keynote was that to build great software, build your own hardware, right? And the interchangeable thing in that statement is one common thread, right? Which talks about sort of the equity value that Apple was able to create, as well as influence every single company in technology to create, which is vertical integration, right? And after the iPhone, if you study every single product that Apple had released after that, they created a vertically integrated system into everything that they created, right? So your Apple Watch, if you own one, runs an operating system called watchOS. Your TV has its own operating system called tvOS. Your car has CarPlay. Your Mac has macOS. Your iPad has iPadOS. They've created a unique ecosystem for every single thing that they've created. Now that gives them not only the freedom and autonomy to control not only the hardware and software, but also to substantially and quantifiably not only set but control the viability of the business in itself. And so this was something that I was thinking about as I was creating, for the last 10 years, that hip hop in itself, which is something I grew up within, is its form has its own equity, right? But it hasn't been defined yet, right? And by that I mean there's a lot of value that's associated with hip hop, but there's no calculable value because there's no products, there's no ecosystem, there's no inherent system that every single thing that it depends on. Instead, there's second ownership, right? So you think of Grandmaster Flash taking a already existing product, right, the turntable at that time, and reverse engineering that in a very startup fashion and creating a whole culture and a whole movement behind that. But we didn't create the turntable, right? You think about the microphone and DJs at that time and MCs at that time, master of ceremonies, picking up a microphone that was created, adding more value than even the microphone in itself, but still not creating an ecosystem where we were manufacturing microphones, right? So something that I realized to raise the equity of what it meant to be amongst, or to be within, a specific culture, especially as it relates to, Black and African culture, we needed to build ecosystems that were completely independent on other ones, right? Ergo software and hardware, which is the space that we exist in right now. And it's been happening for years. We've seen it with software, right? We all use a Netflix and a Hulu and an Apple Music and all these services. And it's really, we're renting server space, right? We're renting these services. Software as a service is redefining and changing the future. And we've seen that in software, but we also need to see that in hardware as well. But I see the difference this time is the integration of not only just biomimicry, which talks about the emulation of nature, but biophilia, which talks about the inherent need for humans to connect with nature. And no matter what technology you use at home, no matter what technology you have or are thinking about buying, the reason why you're buying that technology at the end of the day is for a longing of emotional connection, which you get the most from with nature, right? So I think it's important that with this second wave, as we start to think about, we move away from equality and we move towards equity, that we realize that and sort of the empathetic value that we can bring this time in. But also, before I end this, I think it's also very, very important for us to bring something up that seldom happens in technology. And I think fighting for equality in technology is or fighting for diversity in technology is the equivalent of having one flower and simply fighting for that flower to be represented in a different colorway, right? Versus saying, hey, here's a completely different seed. We can plant the seed and germinate it into a completely different type of flower. which I feel like has been lacking in technology. We've been fighting and we've been talking about how technology, this specific technology should also fit, incorporate this group of people or this race of people or this group of people, rather than saying, hey, maybe if we exposed children to how, or youth into how to build operating systems and low-level programming languages to build things like that, rather than telling them how to build apps, we're setting them up both from a equity standpoint as well as a true success point for the future, because they're not dependent on another platform that could kick them off at any time, or as soon as that platform becomes irrelevant, they wouldn't have anything. So I think as it relates to equity, what's really going to define, our social equity, or just, as we think about design thinking or all these different elements, what's really going to shift it into a completely new light is when we start to realize the difference between true representation and diversity. And diversity is just a different colorway to me, right? That's from what I've seen. It's a fighting for a different colorway, or in most cases in technology, which has been extremely biased, we're fighting for an opinion on something that wasn't created for us to begin with, right? But if we shift that and we start thinking about, hey, we're not saying we want a diversity of being able to build another app, right? We're saying we want diversity and being able to be represented on a higher level and a higher scale, right? So yeah, I think that's when we'll start seeing a lot of change. And that's what, to me, when we have the conversation of equity versus equality, these are the types of things that will be paramount towards seeing that next level of evolution.
Yeah, I really love the comparison between Steve Jobs, Mac, and hip hop, of just like the different ecosystems that exist with that. I think that's like, it's such a perfect reflection of the lack of equity. Because I think one thing that you were saying is, one thing that I was hearing when I was listening to you say that, I was thinking about how Grandmaster Flash and Steve Jobs, there's really not much of a difference between them. The only thing is Steve Jobs protected his money by creating IP around everything, but it wasn't like Steve Jobs was creating anything new. Steve Jobs was looking at technology that already existed, putting it inside of Mac, and then protecting it and making it so you can only access that technology under, when you were using Mac devices. So I think this isn't even to the point of creating equity, but it possibly maybe of just, there needs to be a way that Black people are protecting their cultural value. And we have no way to do that. Like there is a monetary value to hip hop. White people are making a whole lot of money off of it. We're not. So it's how can we contain it so that people can't access it unless they are paying, and it's going directly to the Black creators that are creating it. But another thing is that with these questions, I always worry that people are looking at technology as like this tech determinism, as a tool that can save the world. It can never do that. It's always going to reflect people. And just as Iddris said, it's only going to be a tool. That's all it ever is. So I think before we even look at tech creating equity, it's all about how can we make sure that the society that we live in is healthier, creating healthier economic situations for, all people, and then using technology just as a tool to expand that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there in terms of the system that we exist in that then starts to skew who gets the value of what's being created. And so in that kind of concept, I like from what you're saying, Iddris, does the person who extracts the value, should they own the actual equity or of the thing that's being created? Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to go off of what Ari and even Aishatu said earlier, I think this inherent need of to me, we need to create languages and we need to create terminologies that are native and directly affect these communities, right? Let's talk about one thing that we've been doing is encouraging people to protect their IP. And one thing that we came up with, at Ethos and Spatial Labs is we came up with this equation, hip equals hop, right? And we say a high intellectual property in most cases is equal to a high outputted product. So if you look at any of these companies, right, they have a high intellectual property, they have a lot of IP, right? Amazon, IBM, Cisco, all these companies own a lot of patents, and therefore they're able to create more and more products, right? But in most cases, we're not protecting our IP because we're not informed on those things. And I think the information on how to do those things shouldn't be the same as other communities, only because things need to be curated for these communities, right? Like we started using, when we were teaching like kids how to code in Compton, we were teaching them algorithms, right? Like spelled rhythm, like to invoke the cultural element of it, right? We were coming up with terminologies that were inherent and native to them. Because, you know, there's over, in America alone, there's over 2,500 different computer languages used in total. All of them are Latin based, right? So it even just shows you like, wow, what would a programming language look like, or infrastructure that was created in Benin or Togo, or, you know, like in Compton, or, you know, Boyle Heights, like what would these systems look like, and what type of terminologies would be used when, you know, when creating these things. I really feel like, to go back to what you were saying, I think us creating without documentation renders us not able to protect what we do. And oftentimes we see that a lot. I mean, we all know that one friend that's like, I had this idea first. And you're like, okay, show me. They're like, well, I think the information on the importance of IP in this space is really, really important. And being in the position of true information so we can control our own things. I was talking to a friend the other day, and I was like, we all know Basquiat, we all know Warhol, we all know, you know, so many, I could sit here all day and mention so many different artists. These artists, Banksy, these artists, you know, have their art pieces that they work on for years at a time, right? Put in some of the most prestigious museums in the world, and they go for millions of dollars. But a lot of creators, especially that are African or Black, that are in this space of entertainment, that don't get to create, but rather, or we get to create from the lens of a consumer, but not from the lens of a creator. Majority of people that are in the music space and the entertainment space are, no matter how long it took them to create their work of art, no matter how much time and design thinking they put into it, they're told that their song is $1.99 on Apple Music. The value is set for you. You have no way of escaping that boundary unless you're in the perspective of creating from the lens of a creator and not a consumer. So I think, you know, Azeez, like with what you just said, I 100% think that, you know, the equity should be given to the creators. The equity should be given to people that create these things in itself. And what we realize, whether it's streaming platforms, whether it's app companies, the people that know nothing and value nothing about that which is being consumed make the most money, right? And the creators, the content creators that are developing in itself make pennies, if anything. TikTok, all these platforms that a lot of the youth are using are generating so much buzz for people. And I think, you know, within our communities, there hasn't been an intrinsic value on relationships yet. I think people haven't realized that. A lot of people have so many relationships and have so many different ways that I feel like there hasn't been an intrinsic value on that set. But I think, you know, identifying those things and encouraging the next generation and the current generation of creators to understand the importance of IP and trademark and you know, just protecting their ideas is so important, right? I know people that patented things in the 80s and never even launched it and made banks because other companies later wanted to license that technology out. Think about how many creators in this space. Imagine if you could patent your music. Imagine if you could, you know, register your verses and to certain things like that by attaching it to different things. So yeah, I'm in there, but I'm in 100% agreement and for content creators or, you know, architect design thinkers of the current world and the new world being able to fully control their IP and their ideas.
This actually brings up a few like really great points, and I want to get Ari's and Aishatu's perspective on this. Like, so one, when we talk about language, right? I've always said that like language is the basis of conscious thought. So in order to start a civilization, to start a group or anything like that, there needs to be a shared form of communication. And so at that point that communication has been created, that way of communicating is being created, any new person that's coming into that community, if they didn't share in creating that form of communication, how do they actually have a voice, right? And how can they actually communicate their wants, needs, emotions, and feelings, right? And then the language that is used that's being created is actually what then determines how we define and create the systems that we live in that then facilitate how the transactions between relationships happen, right? And so at a certain point, you know, there are people who are deposited into a system that at the very root foundational level, they didn't have a share in the creation of that. And now they have to operate in a way that is foreign to their nature, and they don't really have true equity into the existence in which they're living in. And so like, it kind of goes back to some of what you're saying, Ari, when you're like, the systems that we exist in right now need to be adjusted for us to actually get to the point to where we can use technology as a tool in order to foster equity. And I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more on your perspective on that in terms of how these systems are operating and how these systems are actually making or creating this inequity that we see.
Yeah, I mean, I also kind of want to make room for Aishatu. I know she hasn't spoken in a little bit. I don't know if you have a response to that first.
Yeah, I would like maybe to give an example from the African continent. Me working as a peace innovator, and also the philosophy that under which I work with, I noticed that if you want to develop a product or service, you have to create ownership for it to be successful, and especially when it comes to developing peace or working towards peace. It's especially important that all the actors feel like they're having ownership over the process. So for instance, I've been developing a couple of animated films together with local artists, and we've been using traditional stories in order to develop desirable futures. So I believe that we have to incorporate a lot of speculative design, future thinking, but to really look at the local context and incorporate as much as possible from those histories in order to develop, maybe to find even answers for the future in the past. So you've been talking about technology's role in creating equitable societies. I agree with everyone that technology shouldn't be used just to, like AI right now is being used everywhere, but it's not the solution for everything. So, however, if you're, for instance, featuring peaceful societies, how augmented reality could be used to create really interesting posters for peace, or how you could develop, use language technology in order to identify hotspots for conflict. There's so many possibilities for technology to be used for good. And we've been seeing a lot of negative talk on facial recognition software and how it can be misused to dominate, to survey, etc. But at the same time, it can also be used to find missing persons. And it can be used for good as well. So we have to always be aware when we do a critique also to see how the same technology could be used for something else.
Yeah. Honestly, Azeez, when you were saying your question, I couldn't even hear it because I was so focused on something Iddris had said about making IPs around lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just like, that's crazy. But I'm also thinking about Jay-Z, you know, doing things like he'll say something that Biggie said in another song, and it's kind of like a nod to the past artist's song. So that's like, it's a whole cultural thing. And even like when I'm thinking about, you know, the way that Black people move in the world, we're just not protective of stuff like that. And we don't feel the need to make sure that no one else can profit off of something so that we can only be the ones that are profiting off of it. And what I'm just thinking a lot about now is like, why are we always trying to mimic what they are doing? Why do we have to create systems where we're protecting everything that we have through IPs that no one else can touch it? That's not our culture. And I'm like, when we think about equity, we're always thinking, how can we get what the white person has? How can we have as much wealth as them? But really, do we need that? Like, do we need to be wealthy and living in these huge houses and alone? Or do we really just need to be able to eat, so for our family to be good, to be healthy, to just be in a, you know, an environment that is abundant? We don't need money for that. We just, you know, need to have respect as beings on this planet. So I don't know. I was just like, I couldn't stop thinking about that of what if we were that kind of culture that did that? And, you know, so much would be lost if we did that.
So I actually want to throw that back to Aishatu, because there's a lot of the work that you're doing that really talks about that. It really just talks about the way that technology, the way that the societies and conditions are developed are based off of a particular set of cultural identities and norms that could be in conflict with or are in conflict with ours, are in conflict with indigenous people, are in conflict with African people. We talk about a lot of AI ethics, right, when it comes to technology. And there's something that you brought up in some of your work about cultural ethics. It's like, whose ethics are we talking about? And you know, I'd love for you to kind of touch on that a little bit more in terms of the work that you're doing in post-colonial design, and how that plays a role in what's being created and the systems that's actually being created in the world.
Exactly. So when I talk about post-colonial innovation and design, I try to challenge the current Western-based thinking, because when we look at African or indigenous cultures, they are not based on the same kind of premise. I don't know if you all know the philosopher Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." And there's a real implication in that kind of sentence, because it says that only thinking beings exist, or beings that are being described as thinking or rational. And also it creates this kind of distinction between subject and object. So you have already a separation from yourself to the outside world. So if you look at African or indigenous or non-Western thinking, there's more of a relational thinking, or relational capital is really important in that kind of thinking, because they don't even have a distinction between subject. They don't even have a word for other. You know, that has otherness, other, that doesn't exist. There's only subject-subject relationships, which means the environment is an extension of yourself. You and the other, that doesn't exist in that kind of language. So if we design for societies, or when we design and we have these kind of thinking taken into account, then we don't draw these kind of distinctions that you can find in Western thinking between good and bad, and seeking to remove that what is deemed bad. As you know, maybe this division between good and bad is like a philosophical gesture that goes back to Plato. And I believe that we have to move away from this kind of thinking, because who defines what's good and what's bad?
Sorry. Yeah, so I think that this idea of cultural equity, when we're talking about who has ownership of what, but also the I guess valuation of culture in order to create things. Some of the things that I talk about. So when I think about things like white supremacy paired with capitalism, to me, you know, there's white supremacy becomes this idea of standardization, creating a default. And then once you create that default, you measure the value of everything else against that default. And everything else is seen as something that is not as valuable. And when we're talking about creating, like, rather than looking at trying to build diverse teams, which, as Iddris is saying, is just a different colorway to build objects and things that aren't actually been created for them, actually giving the cultural equity to those systems that already exist, the way that people think, the languages that people use in order to communicate, to understand their reality, to give them those tools that allow them to build their own systems, that allow them to build their own kind of ways of living that actually work for them, rather than trying to fit them into a system into a system that already exists. There are certain things too in terms of like building community, I want like perspective of Iddris, but Ari as well. Like when you're building Afro-Techtopia, a lot of the work that you're doing with the fellows that you have is really just imagining these new worlds that are outside of the systems that we are currently existing in. And so can you talk a little bit about like how you build that community, and how do you start to imagine a new world where all you've known was the one that you exist in?
Yeah, it's definitely not easy. I think one of the first steps in doing that, though, is I think so much of the Black experience is about defining yourself in opposition of, the dominant group. And especially when we're doing social justice work, we're always like, we're anti this, we're anti that. Well, what are you beyond what other people have done and how they exist in the world? Like, look at just your role in this world. So a lot of it is setting that kind of context of, let's define ourselves. Let's look at ourselves in our own mirror and not through the gaze of someone else. And also, let's just give ourselves permission to, not know something, but still understand that, not be trained in something, but know that we have an understanding of it through our experience. Aishatu said that earlier of there's a lot of value in lived experience that we don't take seriously because of the way that we're trained as designers. And that came up in the fellowship of, I had these different tasks for all the fellows to work on. One was designing pedagogy for remote learning amidst poverty. And so the idea was create some set of pedagogical structures for teachers and schools to be able to use with students that don't have access to the internet or this or that. And some people were saying, one person mentioned, I'm not a teacher, so I feel uncomfortable doing this. And we sat on it a little bit, or I sat on the idea a little bit, but then I told them, even though you weren't trained as a teacher, you have been a student for over 12 years. You know what it's like to be on the receiving end. You know what it's like to explain something to someone. There's a lot of experiential knowledge that you have that you can tap into. So you don't have to give yourself this barrier, like you're not allowed to think in this way. And I think we do that even in just our lives as Black people. There's a study on, there's this part of our brain that actually shrinks due to trauma, and it allows you to, it inhibits you from being able to think about the future and plan ahead. So you're only responding to your most immediate concerns. So when you're just living day to day and you're just trying to figure out, how can you survive? You have no time to, think about what kind of world do you want to live in? And when you're constantly protesting what someone else did, you have no time to vision, what are you protesting for? What world are you striving for? So, and then school, it just teaches you to memorize things. You're not really taught to be imaginative and challenge the teacher, but you're taught to answer the questions the way that teacher has trained you to answer it. So it was really a space to tackle so many things that are wrong with the classrooms and academia, and be a space and so many things are wrong with society and the Black experience and the way that we even operate as Black people sometimes, of just, let's be together, let's actually get paid to just imagine and understand that that's really valuable, and just sharing it with the rest of, our community and see what they do with it.
I would love to expand on that, actually, because what Ari said, I think, is really, really important, because it is based on this idea that, you and I, we are both humans, we are both have something valuable to share, but we are individual and we are different humans. And in the same way, technology has some universal traits from an anthropological perspective. For instance, technology can be seen as an extension of the body and an externalization of memory. So if you look at, for instance, Chinese writing and the Latin writing, both are externalizations of memory, but they're still different and both valid. So it's interesting to see how different cultures can define technology or can use ways of knowing, and how both are valid and both have something of an educational value and can show some sort of sensibility. And I think we need to learn from all different cultures. We need to incorporate more views that are different in order to develop a future that is desirable. And for me, as a peace advisor or innovator, I'm really interested in peace and sustainable development. And I believe that in order to achieve that, we have to find different ways that are, in order to tackle issues like climate change, we have to look at maybe a different approach, a different knowledge system that can inspire us to increase awareness. And yeah, just wanted to say that it can be used as something that can help us to liberate, to feel liberation. So, for instance, when I imagine what is possible with technology, I look at my current environment where I am in Benin, in West Africa, and I see how it can be used as something that can preserve knowledge, as something that can help archive and translate, and that can help preserve languages that are about to die out. It can help preserve memory. So, you know, we can use it in different ways. Like we have chatbots right now, but imagine a chatbot that had the memories of a balladeer who knows the knowledge of the country, and who would save this data set and then have it in a cultural, in an arts installation where people could ask this chatbot questions and they could learn. This knowledge would be preserved. I feel like I know technology can be dangerous, but it's a tool, so we can use it for something that can be beneficial for humanity.
Yeah, Iddris, I want to get your thoughts, because there are some things that they were both saying that resonated with something that you mentioned before. You know, like there's a lot of underrepresented communities are so stuck trying to deal with the trauma that they're experiencing from existing, that they can't imagine the world that they want to create for themselves. They're still dealing with the problems of the issues that they're facing. And, you know, in your work, I guess I want you to kind of expand on, like you said, that you see a world where we're creating a better world for everyone, right? You know, it's not always going to be based off of a specific type of identity, but technology and the things that you're creating is a world where we can focus on some very, very large problems that we're dealing with just as people existing in the world. So can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, you know, I absolutely agree with what, you know, Ari and Aishatu were saying earlier. And I think, you know, what sort of, you know, pushes the needle forward in my thought process is realizing, again, you know, and we had briefly spoke about this before, you know, as a kid that got started in tech for almost a decade now, right? Since I was pretty much like 13, I've seen a lot of even how I was practicing traumavation, right? Versus innovation. And we discussed this briefly. A lot of young youth that plan on being in technology or creating in technology are creating to catch up, but that catch up is not built on equal playing field. It's built on fixing what has been broken by others along the way, right? So a lot of people, like in ML or, you know, artificial intelligence, I've realized like a lot of people like, hey, you know, I'm looking at Keras, or I'm looking at TensorFlow, or I'm looking at whatever it might be, and I realize that this, you know, this algorithm or this program can't detect, you know, people of darker pigmentation to the level of precision or confidence that it can detect higher. So I'm going to dedicate the next 5 years of my life to make sure that this program that wasn't created for me to begin with is now at an equal level playing field. But the platform creator is also in 5 years working on more problems that you will have to fix for that, right? So that's something I realized earlier on, that I was playing a game of catch up to perfect someone else's program for free, essentially, or for pennies. And I was like, you know, I don't actually even want to do that anymore. And none of us should have to do that. And the proposition was simply realizing, how far could I go back? Just like when I think of my ancestors, how far back can I think about like my great grandmother or something before I lose a connection, right? So that's my goal with technology. When I think of not only creating it, but for the next generation, how far back can I go to where I can realize the control that I have and branch out, right? If I'm using a end product, like an app, that is dependent on a service, that's dependent on an operating system, that's dependent on a phone. How far back can I draw those connections before realizing it's at this insertion point that I can fully branch out and create a completely new ecosystem? I think our goal is not to assimilate or become like anyone else, right? It's to say that these platforms have been created a specific way, and we should stop having to feel responsible for making them equal when that's not our job to begin with. We should instead be able to create our own representation of something completely different that's different completely. And you know, one of the movies I like to reference in these talks is like, you know, Black Panther, right? And the root system that controlled everything for them was vibranium, right? And it was completely shut off from most of the world, right? You couldn't even get into Wakanda unless you had like, you know, a specific angle that you went in, and, you know, like, or you couldn't even get that. They were completely isolated from the world, not from wanting to keep everything to themselves, right? But understanding that they wanted to create their own culture that was completely independent. And as such, the connection between technology and nature was very organic, right? If you look at how vibranium worked, if you go and watch it, it's very organic. It doesn't feel like just something that's, you know, incoherent with nature, right? So I think, you know, with that topic, it's really interesting because there's a very interesting thing that I think also happens in technology, where sometimes we focus so much on inclusion, and that's fine within our own community. You know what I mean? Like the platforms, we're actually building an operating system right now, and the operating system that we're creating in itself is a free version for, you know, people like Africans, and yeah, like we want to create a system where we're not charging, you know, especially communities that, you know, have been held back, right? But what we're saying at the same time too is we need to protect our own ideas, not from our own people, but from what exists. Just like one thing I say all the time is like, I'm not my ancestors. And by that, I mean like, you know, sometimes you can be too inclusive and realize that your ideas can be taken away from you and then capitalized in a way that can even prevent you from working on your own ideas. And realizing that system in itself is what I think we need to prepare the next generation to understand, that, you know, we always have the most positive intentions. Every single person that I've met in that was doing work in machine learning or artificial intelligence, I've never heard anyone doing any form of research that was said that that person that's creating, or that African or that Black person that's creating this this code base or whatever it might be, or this research, is creating a biased system. I've never heard anyone say that. It's always been the other way around. I've never heard anyone say that. And in reality, most people would create a technology or create a system and say, hey, it detects, or it's better at, the confidence level of this system is better at detecting people of, for example, like dark pigmentation, but it can't detect other people. So guess what? Before we release it, let's fix that. That's what I've realized, you know, with people I've worked with, holding off on something until it's fully ready. Where I feel the, you know, what we've been seeing is releasing something that is heavily flawed and expecting the changes to only come when the community starts talking about them or the community starts responding to them. So yeah, I think it's really important that we sort of balance, or we create a system of dual purpose, right? Which is understanding that, you know, we must always be inclusive, and we must think about completely branching out. Because one thing about me, even growing up, I never wanted to be like anyone else. I just wanted to be me, you know. But how can I be me, and how can I truly be free when I'm in an ecosystem that thrives off of emulation and thrives off of, you know, replication, right? We don't want to be a replica. We just want to be an original. So I mean, I hope that like get, you know, a little more context into it.
Yeah, definitely. I'd want to give Ari and Aishatu a chance to kind of respond to it.
I don't know what to say. I'm just, yeah, I mean, that's just a counterpoint to what was kind of being said earlier. Of we do have, like, you know, we can't be so naive that, you know, the things that we're releasing aren't protected, where we can't even work on it. But then that just makes me think of, we need to explore something I'm always thinking about is how can we create new economic models? Because I've studied socialism for a while. I really enjoy it. I've read about the Tanzania and Ujamaa movements and, you know, how it's been great and really successful, but also not successful in ways that, you know, people are able to live in the way that they want to. Like, there's still a lot of flaws in it. Capitalism, obviously a lot of people are upset about it. I've been upset about it, but I also just think about the things that work within capitalism, but what can exist where it's not this scarcity? I don't even know if this is, you know, answering the question, but like, what can we create that's not going to put us in that mindset to feel the need to protect the things that we're creating? I just want to explore different economic models where we can still feel free to create, but don't have to worry about looking over our shoulder to not make sure that someone's coming after us.
I think that's for us to all collectively decide on what that looks like. You know, I think what we're even talking about in itself is something that, you know, from what I've seen, it rarely happens in terms of a conversational piece. And I think this is like the big question mark of, you know, what we collectively now as a people, as a community need to think about. Because Ari, what you said, and not to cut you off, but what you said is so important, which I think we need to think about this new economic model, right? Because even if we have, yes, we must create and protect, right? But the value of what that protection even means is within an antiquated and very specific model that has been created for us to emulate, right? So what could that look like if we branched out completely from that, right? I think that's something we all have to figure out and think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's like some things that stick out to me. It just sounds like when we talk about inequity, you know, it's something that we divest from. It's not something we fix. It's something that you divest from a system of inequity and you start building systems of equity for yourself. Thinking more so about like kind of like the cultural equity and taking from kind of the historical and cultural identity of the place that you're from, your own identity. How do you start to build and use that source material to build the new conditions for equity? You know, and I think Aishatu, you're doing some of that work, right? The conflict that you're working on is a very old conflict in Benin between farmers and cattle herders, where the concept of ownership is very different, and it's a very different cultural context and understanding in the way that they exist. And at a certain point, you have to bridge both of those conflicting and contradictory understandings of the way that the world works in order to create peace within a conflict of way of life. And how do you manage that? And how do you actually start to figure out how you create cohesion between these two different views, different points, different source materials of the world?
So like you mentioned, I work on a conflict, which is between cattle herders and farmers. And that is one of the oldest conflicts you can find in Africa, the whole continent, not just in Benin where I work, but in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, you name it. It's a conflict that reaches all parts. And it's basically a conflict between two different ways of living. You know, you have the nomadic cattle herders who travel from land to land, who cross borders, and who don't believe in the idea of property like we believe in the Western world, right? So for them, they use the natural resources that they need in order to survive, but they only take what they need and not more. And then you have the farmers who don't move, who live in a specific space, who are really focused on the idea of property and having access to land. So right now, the conflict has been getting more and more violent because you have this problem that there's not enough resources for everybody. So how do you negotiate different needs, different ideas about what it means to have access to land? So what I've been working on is I was looking at the memories, ancient memories of how people used to coexist in peace in the past. And right now, because of climate change, etc., there's not enough resources there. But then I think we need to remember those old practices and then use that in order to interrogate and to create some kind of critical thinking. And that's what I was mentioning before, that, for instance, I've been developing an animated film with a local organization, so with the organization. And one episode is about this old man who's sitting in a village, and everyone is there, young, old, and they're listening to the story that he's telling about how when he was young, when the cattle herders came, everyone was happy about it because it meant that they could sell food, they could, do stuff, and the cattle herders, they would bring something also in exchange. So it was an exchange of goods, but also an exchange of relation, because you would have someone having a marriage ceremony, and then the cattle herder would give them like an animal to eat together. And it's about reminding what I learned during my work here is that relational knowledge, focusing on the relational, focusing on that can actually bring about change in the way people think. And we can also leverage that when we develop technology, to develop technology that can enhance the relational aspect between humans.
All right, so we have about 20 minutes left, so I want to give everyone the chance to ask questions. So in the Q&A, just pop your questions inside. And if you have anything specific to any one of the panel guests or me, then just write the name of the person that you're directing the question at, and I'll read it out. I can hand it back over to Christine or Robbie to field any questions.
Okay, hello everyone. Hi again. We do have some questions. So I think a couple of them have already been covered, but there's one question that says, what's the role of technology in developing communities or countries? I guess that could be to anyone, but maybe Aishatu.
Can you repeat? I was just looking at all the questions.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
It's open, I believe, to the panel. They didn't specify, so I'm just going across on the way the names come up. All of the panel comes up on my screen, but the question is, what is the role of technology in developing communities or countries?
Very good question. I think like it was said before, it is a tool in itself. For instance, I can give an example from my practice here as advisor. Technology could be used, for instance, as an early warning tool in order to prevent conflict. And by preventing conflict, you can foster social cohesion. You can increase peaceful interaction. So this is just a short answer. I think the others also have something interesting.
I can take a little bit of stab at that question though, but because when I think about technology right now and the way that it's actually existed, it's been used to foster standardization at scale. And that goes it's in direct conflict to a lot of the things that we've been saying about equity and the fact that technology can be used in order for people to, one, define the purpose of how it's used within their own community, right? Because they understand their needs, they understand their way of living, and so they understand what they need to create in order to better their own life. But then at a global level, where we have different types of cultures, there needs to be an understanding of cohesion, not that one is dominant over another based off of whatever criteria that somebody has created, but the fact that it's just another way of living and another way of life. It doesn't have to be doesn't have to be a conflict. When I think about a lot of charity, I prefer mutual aid over charity. Mutual aid creates support systems for people to build what they need, when they need it, how they need it, as opposed to charity being another form of policing, deciding who gets what based off of the criteria that I've decided on how I want to give my resources, right? And so you have a lot of Western business people, charitable organizations that are trying to disseminate things to other countries, but trying to pretty much shape them in the image of their own, of themselves, you know, rather than allowing those countries to develop organically what it is that they need for themselves. So when I think about technology and how it's used in the development of communities and the development of countries, really it's up to that community. It's up to that community and that country on how they need to use it in order to develop it. And it's up to them, for them to make their own criteria on what technology is going to do to serve their community, as opposed to somebody else or another country or another person policing how technology is used there.
Yeah, I would also say that with technology, something that I don't know if we've clarified yet, but I think Aishatu mentioned it, of the definition of technology, of it, it's not always synonymous with digitality. And that's also how I started off the Afro-Textopia Fellowship. Of one of the first things that I showed them, at least as far as a way of thinking about technology is merely an extension of human capability. And if we get out of this human-centric idea of design, it's merely an extension of sentient capability. So we don't have to think of how can we use computers and electricity or all these different forms to, you know, enhance our way of being. There are so many ways that communities are doing it, especially the ways that indigenous communities have done it and Native communities have done it in the past, where we're using technology that's just around us. So one example that I think of is the root bridges in India, where there are a lot of monsoons, and they were, you know, they tried to do wooden bridges, and that would allow them to get from one community to another. But every time the monsoons would knock it away. So instead of using root bridges, which take 30 years to create because you're literally growing trees in a certain direction, they're way more durable than any of the bridges that they had before. So when we think of it in that way, we're really, you know, freer to understand that it's just a matter of extending our capability and what can we use around us to allow us to live in a better way.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Okay, I can go on to the next question. From Serena, it says, how should Black folks, people of color, get into creating hardware and not relying on software so they can gain greater control and profit when many fields, parentheses, search engines, Google, social media, Facebook, Insta, et cetera, are so heavily monopolized?
I think that question in itself, I think is missing a little piece, and that's from like, well, if we create hardware, then what software is it going to run? Or if we create software, what hardware is it going to run on? I don't think it's necessarily even about creating software and hardware just to do it, right? And I think sometimes, you know, we can fall into, you know, a role of like, hey, because it doesn't exist, let's build it, when it actually isn't doing anything but doing just, like, I've heard so many people like, you know, build Black Twitter. That's not going to solve anything at all. If anything, it's putting you in the same exact perspective, and you're going to have another subset of something created because the same values are held onto. But I think I would really push forward for, you know, what Ari had just even mentioned, which is like, technology doesn't always have to be represented as a digital thing, right? And for a majority of people, technology is anything that, you know, has a certain, you know, 0 or 1 switch, right? But technology is simply a tool, and tools can be very primitive and still more valuable than digital systems, right? And we see that a lot with infrastructure in specific places and things of that nature. But I really think it really cuts down to this biophilia thing, right? Which is understanding the connection between why we feel attached to, you know, elements of nature or things within nature, and how we can incorporate that within our design ethos or our design thinking process. In fact, one of the things that we've been working on for the last 3 years, we were developing a new operating system, and it's not a mobile operating system. It's really interesting. It's not a mobile operating system, but it's an operating system that incorporates mobile technologies. It's not a transportation operating system, but it's an operating system that factors in transportation. I think now more than ever, we need to think of whether it's hardware or software, we need to think about it very, so in tech, low level actually means high and high means low, right? But we need to think of things very low level and how we can sort of create one unified system with individual modules, and think of those modules as slots that can represent different communities. If you had an overall system that was created by the most diverse from the perspective of those creating it, right? The diverse teams from the ground up working together to create this one unified system that is inherently not going to be perfect, but saying these modules are things that can be updated with time. I feel that's how, that definition of, or that question, even as it relates to how can we create hardware that's not dependent on software, I feel like that's a step forward, right? Realizing that these things aren't going to be perfect. But I think what lacks is the diversity of thought from the inception of an idea, right? We get to probably pre-production or second, third iteration, or the fourth iteration before we want to do sort of like user testing or whatever, bringing in certain people to help curate certain visions. But I think most importantly, when it comes to hardware and software, why are we creating it? No matter what space you're in, is it to solve a genuine need of something that is experienced by all? Or is it with the hopes of solving it for your own community and then scaling it up to be something that can assist everyone? But I think if we're just stopping at, okay, there's no Black hardware thing in this space, so I'm going to create something to help the Black community in this space. If that's as far as you can go with the vision or idea, then to me, I think it's something that isn't, to me at least, I don't think it's something worth focusing a large amount of time on it, because you're technically not solving, the full problem of even what that's inherently going to create, because that in itself is going to create another problem. So I don't have the definite answer to that. I can just answer based off of, I feel like, what I've experienced and what I've seen. And I think when you're thinking of hardware or software, don't just think of it or create it just because there's a lack of it within one specific community, without thinking about how it can, enhance or help everyone. Because we also have to remember that this isn't like the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where like machines were still so big and we're making boxy cars so we could only make like 10,000 in production. We're making things that are experienced by millions of people, right? So if you're not thinking about, before your product even, or whatever you're creating gets to, a million people using it, you need to understand that the App Store, Google or Android, has over, 1 billion apps for iOS, I think, and like over 400, 500 million for Android. I don't know the exact numbers, don't quote me on that. But the moment you submit it, you're opening it up to millions and millions of people being able to access it from different communities. So it's something that I think people should think about. So that would be my answer. My answer would be, I don't have the definite answer to what we can do in terms of what should be built and what should be built. But I think the full thought process of, is this thing that I'm creating, whether hardware or software, going to be used to enhance the general problem at large, or is it only going to affect this community, which in itself can breed more problems in itself? So that's
okay. Thank you, Iddris. This is a question from AJ to Aishatu. In the West, spirituality or relationship to ancestors or wider ecosystems is devalued. What can you imagine might come from incorporating spiritual practices as a path toward designing peace?
That is a very good question. Yeah, like I've been mentioning before, I believe that we can learn a lot from incorporating non-Western thinking. And for instance, I made the example of the Cartesian, I think before I am, from Descartes. And if you look at South African philosophy called Ubuntu, they have this idea that we think, therefore I am. So thinking of yourself as a collective, as part of a humanity, I think this is a very important value that can influence the way we design, the way we do technology. and that can help us develop a path towards peace. But maybe I should also define what I mean by peace, because I haven't done that yet. In my practice as a peace advisor, there's this distinction between positive peace and negative peace. And positive peace is the absence of violent conflict, because there's this, it's based on the premise that there's always going to be conflict between people, because there's always going to be different interests, different needs that need to be negotiated. So negative peace means violent conflict. So this is what we want to reduce as peace advisors, as peace practitioners. So anything that can work towards positive, towards reducing violent conflict, that is actually like the philosophy of Ubuntu, that can lead towards people not seeing themselves as distinct beings, as others, but by realizing that we need the other to survive, and also we can care about the other without having to like the other. So I think we can learn a lot about what it means to be a human, what is personhood. I think all these ideas can help us to develop a more peaceful world. And what I've learned here while living here is also the importance of incorporating non-humans as actors and stakeholders. For instance, the last 2 weeks I've been traveling around the country, exchanging with different stakeholders, and I was in one area which is called Chaoru, and what is really interesting, 2/3 of the place is they say it's occupied by the forest. So, you know, the forest is part of the discussion about access to resources. So they have to think about, you know, also the needs of, you know, the forest. Or there's another area that has a lot of mountains. So when they talk about, you know, needing access to land, also they have to think about how the mountains are part of the discussion, and also taking space, you know. So I think these kind of non-Western ways of thinking can help us to look at things in a different way and maybe find interesting pathways towards peace.
I'm looking at our time. We have a handful more of questions, so I'm not sure if we are free to go a little bit over, but maybe we can try to, and some of these are pretty meaty, but maybe we can address a couple of the hopefully quicker ones. So this kind of takes us into a different space. This is really looking at workplace and team building. There's a question here from Julie about suggestions to assemble more diverse teams.
Azeez,
Yeah, I could take that. So the easiest thing that I can say is, like, if you're looking for Latin people, if you're looking for Black people, don't show up to white neighborhoods asking for them, right? So, like, when you're trying to build these diverse teams, they exist, they're there, and the talent level that you're looking for exists. And, you know, you have to go to the communities that you're not comfortable going to in order to find them. You know, I mean, that's at the base level. But just assembling a diverse team in itself is not the thing. You know, so, like, you can, like, no one wants to be invited into a hostile culture. And so what a lot of people, you know, whether in any underrepresented group, kind of end up falling into, right? You know, they become the first Black, like, I'm actually very much tired of hearing, you know, the first Blacks this or the first woman this or that, because that means that you put that person in a situation where they're the only one, and, like, they're, like, overextended in a battlefield, you know, and that's not a really great situation to put somebody in and be able to extract the value that they can provide to your company or to your team, right? So the diversity part is another side of the inclusion part that you really need to make sure that you're creating the psychological safety net for them to actually be authentic to themselves. You have to go to those communities, one, looking for those people because of who they are, not because of the criteria that you've decided to police them against, right? Not because you've decided that, you know, I want somebody who is a Harvard grad, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these kind of criteria that you use to define your maybe white counterpart or whoever's on your team, and then say like, I want to find that in a different color or shade. You know, like you can't do that. You know, you really have to open up your mind and say, I'm going to go and find this person because I want them authentically for who they are. And they might not fit the criteria that I'm normally used to, but I understand that their identity and the authenticity of their identity is something that's going to provide value to what I'm trying to build, because they understand the product, or they understand like how that product is going to interact with at least themselves, that intersectionality of themselves and the communities that they're a part of, way more than I would.
Yeah, I would emphasize a few points that Azeez has said of just the not the only one. Like often people think you can just hire one, but I would say you can never hire just one person. It has to be a group hiring, because it gives them a community and it allows them to have some leverage of they can come together and, you know, challenge something. But also, Azeez was saying, hostile environment. And I'm thinking about the people that don't even realize that they're creating a hostile environment. So they have no idea what how to avoid that. And so I think, again, that comes to not the only one, because they're so ingrained in their own culture. They have no idea, you know, maybe the passive aggressive things that they say or the microaggressions, they have no idea what it feels like on the receiving end. So I think a big way to get away from that also is just like a group hire. And also, you know, at Afrotectopia, I have a lot of people that are coming and trying to use Afrotectopia as a sort of like diversity pipeline kind of thing, because they don't understand why Black people aren't interested in working for them. And oftentimes I can look at their website in a few seconds and tell them why, because it's not catering to Black people. Like it's so white centric, and all of these, there's so much language without anyone saying anything that you can just grab from someone's company. So if you're really interested in diversifying, you really have to be invested in other people's cultures and ways of being.
Thank you, Ari. So there's 3 more questions. Do you guys think we can get through that? Are you willing to go a little over? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So
I'm cool with it, you know.
Okay.
I'm good.
All right. Aishatu, is that good for you as well? And Ari?
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. So going back, this one personally, as we were talking about nature, and that's kind of been a thread that's gone through this conversation today. AJ has a question, Iddris, for you, which says, one way that trees communicate is by using mycelium. What do you think the study of fungal threads could teach us about developing communication tools across or within species?
That's a very great question. I'm not too well versed with that in particular. I think the biomimicry that I've been like mostly just studying is really just communication from like, for example, like ants, right? And the networks that they create, or textures, right? So shark scales, things of that nature. I think things of that nature. I think the beauty is that just by going outside, right? And I know this seems like a very cliche thing, but just by going outside and just having an hour in nature and just studying the interaction between all these different living organisms and all these different, things, you would notice so much. You would notice so much coexistence that we are doing our best as a people to emulate, right? You go outside to any green field around you or any space, you would just see there's at least 50 different variations of insects or whatever that are all coexisting, and there's a natural balance between those. And rather than attempting to create something completely new, I think we can study that, right? One story that I really love to reference is the bullet train that was being developed in Japan, right, in the early, I think 80s. And they were studying all these different, they wanted to reduce the drag coefficient, blah, blah. When it went into the tunnel, it was creating this noise, and they needed more energy to power it. And they studied a kingfisher bird's beak, right? It wasn't a scientist. It was like I think he was a biologist that came in and said, hey, let's study the bird of this, let's study the beak of this bird and how it dives in to catch its prey. And they modeled the whole bullet train on that in itself. So I think I don't know in particular with, you know, the fungus that grows on the trees or how they communicate, but I think there's so many different examples of that, if not even larger ones that we can study from to inform how we create, especially on a societal level.
Yeah, I would also just like to add to this question, AJ, because I love it, of just like mycelium, and it's something I study a lot. I just finished reading The Hidden Life of Trees, where it's all about, you know, the ways that trees are communicating with each other. And one thing I'm doing with my students right now is I've tasked them to look at understand the internet, so it's self-guided research on the way that the internet works, and then also look at a whole other system. So it could be, one of my examples was mycelium, or like ant colonies or highways, and think of how you can create a new internet based on an aspect of this completely alternative system, but there's a sort of infrastructure that connects them. And one of the students, she was learning about, she discovered in her research trees and their, I have a hard time saying this word, but pheromones, whatever it is, P-H-E-R-O, mones, and how they release a sense when they feel like they're in danger. And so she's going to use that whole way of how trees, when an animal's eating their leaves and they release a sense and other animals know not to mess with these trees right now, to create a whole VPN structure. So now there's a security system for this internet based on the ways that trees operate. So I think, you know, combining natural systems with technical ones, there's so much possibility with it.
Thank you, Ari. We've got a couple questions from one or more of our attendees in the Caribbean. The question is, how can young Caribbeans, Bermuda, Bahamas, Trinidad, et cetera, partake and partner with the Black tech movement in the US? I think many of us have shared heritage experience and want to tap in, but don't have the proper channels to do so. Our challenge is limited population size, so scale is also a challenge. This person is from Bermuda with a population of 60,000, but they have a rich visual culture that augmented reality could really be good for. And they said Iddris and Ari.
Ari, you wanna go first?
I'll let you go first.
Okay, all right, for sure. Yeah, I think, yeah, there's so many applications of augmented reality in ways that we haven't even thought of or seen, and I mean that as a collective group of people. I think as it relates to, you know, from what I've seen in terms of like, you know, connecting with, you know, like African different parts, is like, I'm gonna refer to like diasporic, you know, like, you know, connections. You know, where I'm from, Ghana, last year and the year before that, they kind of opened up the borders and created the year of return, right? Encouraging more people to come and rediscover that which is theirs. And one of the things, because when I went out there, I had a meeting. I had a meeting with the president of Ghana and the minister of technology out there, and the importance of encouraging people, and even the descriptive language of like, I realized like a lot of, you know, like African American people from here felt a disconnect with like, yeah, even though I'm from Africa, I don't feel connected to anything. I don't feel like I own anything, right? And so it was really important that when people even connected back to their origins, that they felt like this is also mine. I'm a part of this ecosystem. And I think it's interesting because whether it's actually visiting, which, you know, not everyone will have the means for, right, to coordinate a whole trip to go connect with their roots. I think if we took technologies like AR, you know, or machine learning or several other technologies to recreate worlds or recreate, you know, environments, whether it's current, what currently exists or what has existed before, we can increase not only people's morale, but people's willingness to want to go, you know, like return back or embark on these things. And one thing at the time that I was working with the president over there before like COVID happened was creating sort of an AR experience, because in Ghana they have different castles. There's their Elmina Castle, there's the Gold Coast Castle, there's different castles, and these were actually castles where slaves were docked at before leaving, and there's a specific point called the point of no return, right? Because usually that meant that you weren't coming back. So we started working on this AR experience where you could plug that into your home, and we would do a real-time mesh and slam detection. So it would respond to your natural environment and you could feel what it was like to be there. We felt that this would create sort of like an emotional connection for you, which are experiencing something that has happened before, or, you know, the remnants of that exist somewhere in the world right now, in real time. So I think there's obviously ways for, because AR was something that came up in that question, there's ways for technologies like AR to help restore that connection. But I think more importantly, it's just exposure, right? The exposure into reading more and looking into, you know, wherever it might be, whether it's, you know, it's Togo, or it's Bermuda, or it's, you know, somewhere halfway across the world that you've never been, but you've been excited or intrigued so much about, or you actually live within. I think one thing that I've generally realized is within the Western world, when it comes to anything indigenous or anything diasporic, or you're constantly, you're majority of the time being misled. So you have to go out and find the true origins of these things. And what I've realized is even connecting with indigenous people, something that I've greatly come to appreciate, right? There's moments where I literally take a month off and just travel and go somewhere and just talk to, I'm talking like the 80, 90-year-old people in certain communities, and just absorbing and learning from them. When we were building this school in Ghana, last 2 years, I started building the school over a 10-acre field in Ghana. And before I even started, I went into Osu and I went to all these different communities and just learned from the elder community on how, you know, the aesthetic should look like, right? What type of building materials we should look like. I was studying like Joseph Eichler and not using electricity to build homes. But when I went out there and realized how they operated, I was like, okay, cool. Why am I going to build a school that's based off of a Western architectural, you know, standpoint, when I can go back to the indigenous people that know how to create prefabs better than anyone else in the world, you know, and then start from there. So I think that would just be my answer, right? There are instances of technology being able to facilitate and create those, you know, those connections. But I think more importantly, like Ari had mentioned, technology doesn't always have to be in the form of, you know, binary or digital or anything digital. It could also be in the interaction of just listening to someone and realizing how they can help you with efficiency of, you know, building or whatever it might be. So yeah, I mean, that's how I would answer that, and I'll pass it to Ari.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to understand the question, but there are some things that are sticking out to me. Like, for one, tapping into the Black tech movement, I would love to know what you feel like is stopping you. Because like with Afrotectopia, with the fellowship, we had people from all over. We had people from all over the States. They were outside the country, UK, Ghana, Paris, France. So it's like, I feel like with the internet, you can tap in. I don't know what would stop you. And then with scaling, something I'm always apprehensive of is just this idea of scaling. Like, that's not where power is. You don't have to be this big thing. You know, people sometimes, entities that are the most popular or have a lot of numbers and whatever, you know, followers and stuff, that's not the quality of the work. That's more of the attention given to it. So you don't really have to, I just always try and help. And as people have done for me, it's not always about the number, but it's just about the quality and you know, speaking and cultivating, you know, a strong community and tapping into the people that are interested in joining and building something strong with them.
If I can, I'll just add to that. I mean, there are some communities that have been created, like, so Ari just mentioned Afrotectopia, and she has a Slack channel. I'm part of Design to Divest, that I've worked on building that community, and also Where Are the Black Designers? And these organizations, like, I mean, through COVID has kind of created a situation to where people actually are a little bit more accessible because we're grounded in where we are. So like technology, we have these Zoom calls, we're able to host this, you know, and not have to like fly everyone to one location. So like it's building community in some ways is become slightly easier if you just reach out to people and try to tap into the communities that already exist. And I can definitely drop some links for Afrotectopia, Where Are the Black Designers, Design to Divest, for if you want to join and collect and connect with other creatives who are aligned with some of the things that you're thinking about.
Thank you, Azeez. I think we'll do one last question, and I think we'll be following up with all of the attendees over email with kind of links and sharing all of this great information. This last question is to everyone, so we can kind of go down the line. Aishatu, I think if you don't mind answering first, who or what inspires you in your work? And then everybody else gets a little extra time to think about it.
That's a very good question. I get inspired by the people I work with. I get inspired by exchanging with people who live in a village, learning from their ways of living, their ways of being. I get inspired when I look at how technology is being used for good, how it connects people to the different ways that, for instance, there's this really cool app called Walk with Yashi, and it's a chatbot with which you can learn what it means to walk long distances carrying water. And it contextualizes the human side of the global water crisis through a multi-sensory journey. So you get some messages where you hear the sounds of footsteps of a young girl who represents a girl living in Ethiopia, and you can hear the music of the village, you can see the sights of her past, you can listen to her voice, and it's kind of connecting people to this kind of experience. And it's a 2.5 hour journey, which you can walk together with this character from this chatbot, and I find that very inspiring. Or I've read about this really cool computer game called Salam, which was developed by a former refugee from South Sudan. And he learned how to code while he was in a refugee camp. His mother saved several years to buy him a computer, and then he learned how to code. And he developed a game where you can live or see the experience of someone running for their life, living the journey of a refugee. And the really inspiring thing of this game is that, you know how in computer games you can buy things with real money, like in-app kind of things you can buy. But here in this game, you can buy water, you can buy food, you can buy a tent. And when you buy these things, you're actually buying food for someone who's living in a refugee camp, or you're actually buying a tent, or I don't know, some goods for someone living in a refugee camp. And I find these kind of uses of technology really inspiring. And, yeah, I'm looking forward to see what's coming next for people, and how they use technology in a very unexpected ways.
Thank you. I guess we will go to Ari. Do you mind answering that same question? So who or what inspires you?
A lot of things inspire me. This conversation alone has inspired me. I'll be thinking about the things that we talked about for so long. I mean, Aishatu and Iddris inspired me, and Azeez, we've had conversations, and just hearing your thoughts have inspired me. Other places that I love to look, I mean, being in a classroom is so inspiring. I get to, that's my favorite part of being in a classroom as an educator. I just get to learn from my students and see what they're thinking and the ways that they go off and create stuff in response to the prompt. Books inspire me. I love books. You can learn so much from historically what people have done, and gain lessons for potential futures. So I think it's just people around me, people that are very intentional and thoughtful and very comfortable diving deep into their own passions. Those kind of people really inspire me.
Thank you. Iddris, the question was who or what inspires you?
Oh, that's a very great question. I think first and foremost, I'm inspired by everyone on this call. I've learned a lot, and I think it's beautiful to just have so many different perspectives as well. And I think that's what we need more in the world anyway, right? Perspective. So I'm so grateful for that. I think the goodness of humanity, right, is something that inspires me constantly every single day. And as a kid that was raised Islamically, one thing that I love is this word in Arabic called rahma, and rahma means mercy, but it can also be translated to empathy, right? And I think that's the number one thing that really inspires me at the end of the day, to see so many people whether it's us on the call or everyone in this panel connecting, to really think about, you know, empathy on a different level and how they can use empathy as a universal thread to, you know, to weave this beautiful pattern. And I truly feel like, you know, what's needed most in the world is empathy, and we'll start to see true, genuine change in the world when the powers that be submit to the will of empathy. So I think for me, if it came to I wouldn't even categorize it as an emotion. If it came to an energy, it would be empathy, right? But constantly, the people I'm working with every day, even everyone, you know, within this space right now, is really what gets me going. Like after this, I'm like, all right, cool. Like, all right, go back to the drawing board and we're gonna work on this next and that next. So I think for me, it's really the goodness of our species, the goodness of our civilization. Or I think not, I wouldn't want to use the word civilization because it's often associated with certain things. So the goodness of just humanity, as well as the empathy, the inherent empathy that exists from within, is what inspires me the most.
Thank you. Azeez, we'll close it out with you and then wrap up this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, those are just great answers, so it's hard to follow. But
I
like,
know.
I mean, similar things. You know, I'm very inspired, one, by my own experience, right? Like just the things that I'm able to encounter. I feel like blessed to be where I'm at. You know, and I was thinking about this the other day. Is just like when it comes to like, sometimes people are always looking for change, but I embrace change as growth, as opposed to something that I need to like move away from. Like I need to like make an about face because my life is whatever. You know, I always just think of my life and my experience as exactly where I need to be, and embracing where I am and what I am doing allows me to see the opportunities for growth. And the other thing that really inspires me, like, is one, people, because the people that come into my life then start to shape my perspectives in ways, either refining it because it contradicts or it's different, or it aligns and it gives me new language in order to express what it is that I'm trying to communicate. And then lastly, it's really like the future. Like I'm always inspired by what could be, you know, where we could go. You know, what already exists is kind of like cool. Like I understand what this is right now, but there's always something more. And I'm not, you know, I feel like when it comes to like, you know, as a person, like I think that you definitely could be very, very happy with your experience while also not being satisfied with what exists, right? You know, and I don't think that there's a dichotomy, that those things are kind of mutually exclusive to each other, right? Like happiness and satisfaction aren't the same thing. And I think that me being inspired by the future is that I'm happy with the present and in some ways, and with my experience where I am at. You know, I'm embracing that, but I'm not satisfied with what's here, which makes me inspired to create and build and do more. You know, so yeah, that's kind of what inspires me. It's just my experience, the people who I encounter, and the future.
Thank you, Azeez. This has been just such a pleasure, and I'm looking at all the incredible feedback in the chat, and I think there's so much to think about and just a lot of remarkable energy around this great dialogue today. So I'll just start with gratitude for each of our incredible speakers. Thank you all so much for being a part of it. All of our attendees, thank you so much. We will be following up, as I mentioned, over email, sharing more information, and we'll be hosting more dialogues as part of this series. So I just encourage you to attend. Be safe, take care, and thank you all. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.